I woke up because the silence arrived too fast. One moment the woods were breathing the way they always did, at night crickets sawing at the dark, leaves rubbing together, something small moving under the porch. The next moment it was all gone. Not fading, not thinning out, gone, like a switch had been thrown somewhere I couldn't see. My eyes were already open before I understood why. I lay still on the narrow bed, staring up at the ceiling, my breath shallow and held without omission. The cabin was so quiet I could hear my pulse ticking in my ears, each beat loud enough to feel intrusive. Even the old boards beneath me, usually restless, had stopped creaking. That was when the feeling settled in. Not fear, not yet. Tension. It pressed in from one direction only, heavy and focused, as if the dark outside the window had leaned closer to inspect something small and specific. Me, I didn't move. I didn't turn my head. I watched the black rectangle of the window out of the corner of my eye, half expecting it to change shape, to show something where the glass reflected nothing but my own pale outline. Nothing appeared. The silence held, tight and unnatural, long enough for confusion to creep in beside the fear. Long enough for my heart to slow just a fraction, as if my body had decided this wasn't an emergency yet. Then, all at once, the woods exhaled. Sound rushed back, in crickets, resuming mid-song, leaves shivering, the faint groan of the cabin settling into itself. It was so sudden I almost laughed, the release sharp and dizzying. I told myself it was nothing. That isolation did strange things to people who weren't used to it. That my uncle had warned me about how quiet it could get out here, and I'd misunderstood what he meant. I rolled onto my side and went back to sleep. In the morning, the cabin looked harmless again. Sunlight poured through the windows, dust motes drifting lazily in the air. The forest beyond the clearing was busy and bright, birds darting between branches, insects humming as if they'd never stopped. I made coffee, stood on the porch, and breathed in the damp, green smell of the place. Whatever had happened in the night felt distant, unreal, like the tail end of a dream that dissolved the more you thought about it. I didn't leave. Normal people would have. I know that now. They would have packed up, laughed at themselves for getting spooked, and driven back toward noise and lights before the day had a chance to change its mind. I stayed because nothing bad had happened. That justification mattered more than it should have. The second night, the silence came again. Earlier this time, I was still awake, sitting at the small table with a book open in front of me, when the words on the page seemed to lose their eddies. I looked up just as the sound vanished, the quiet snapping into place so cleanly it felt rehearsed. I didn't wait for my body to react. I stood and went to the window, drawn by the same instinct that makes you look up when you feel eyes on your back. Moonlight spilled across the clearing, silver and flat, stopping short of the trees as if the darkness beyond had weight. I scanned the tree line slowly, telling myself I was looking for movement, for proof that something tangible was responsible. I didn't see anything move, but I knew exactly where the retention rested, though just left of the thick oak at the edge of the clearing, not rushing, not hiding, simply there. The thought that came to me then was quiet and dangerous in how reasonable it felt. Whatever was out there wasn't attacking. It was watching. That realization brought relief before it brought fear. Relief slid into place sizzily, smoothing over the unease, convincing me there was a difference between being hunted and being observed. When the silence lifted and the night resumed its ordinary noises, I slept deeply without dreams. The third night, I noticed the pattern. The quiet never came when I was moving quickly, not when I was cooking, or pacing, or fussing with the radio. It waited for stillness, for moments when my attention drifted, when there was room for something else to occupy it. It didn't wake me again. It waited until I was already awake. That detail lodged somewhere in the back of my mind, heavy and unresolved. On the fourth morning, I found the tracks. They were pressed into the soft dirt near the tree line, deep and deliberate, as if something heavy had paused there, shifted its weight, then turned away. The impressions were too long for a wolf. The toes splayed in a way that made my stomach tighten when I tried to picture the anatomy that could have left them. They stopped in a shallow arc that curved around the clearing. I followed that arc slowly, step by careful step, until I realized something else. The grass thinned along the same line, giving way to darker soil that looked compacted, worn smooth by repeated pressure. Beyond it, the forest floor appeared untouched, leaf litter thick and undisturbed. I stood with my boots just short of that invisible boundary and felt a faint resistance in the air, like stepping into colder water. I didn't cross it. That night, the silence arrived as soon as I turned off the lights. I stood near the door, heart pounding, the sense of attention heavier than it had been before. It felt closer now, intimate enough that I had to fight the urge to adjust my posture, to stand straighter, the way you do when you realize someone important is watching. The pressure lingered longer than usual, stretching the moment thin. Then, from somewhere beyond the boundary, something moved fast through the woods. Branches snapped, underbrush tore. Whatever it was sounded panicked, fleeing, crashing blindly through the dark. Another sound followed it, higher, thinner, desperate in a way that made my skin prickle. The noises cut off abruptly. The silence slammed down, so hard it made my ears ring. I waited for the thing that had won to charge into the clearing, for the boundary to fail. Nothing happened. When the woods finally breathed again, I realized my hands were shaking. I told myself, for the first time out loud, that maybe whatever lived out there was keeping other things away, that maybe the line around the clearing wasn't a limit meant for me at all. That belief settled in quietly, like something I'd always known. And once it took hold, I stopped thinking about leaving. That belief made the next few days easier than they should have. I settled into routines. Morning walks along the edge of the clearing. Coffee on the porch. Small repairs inside the cabin that didn't really need doing. The forest stayed busy in daylight, almost exaggerated in its normalcy, as if it were compensating for something. It withheld at night. Nothing crossed the line. Not deer, not raccoons, not even the stray dog I'd seen once, early on, trotting along the dirt road before vanishing back toward a town. The clearing felt curated, like a space something larger had decided to keep orderly at night. The silence continued its visits, always measured, always brief, always ending without consequence. I began to anticipate it, the way you anticipate a train passing in the distance. I'd pause whatever I was doing when the quiet fell, stand still, let the moment wash over me. Each time, the pressure of attention felt more familiar, less alarming. That was when the tests started. The first one was so small I almost dismissed it. I was rinsing dishes at the sink when I felt a ton absence behind me, like the room had lost depth. Before I could turn, the door handle moved. Not a rattle, not a yank, just pressure. Slow, careful. The handle dipped a fraction of an inch, stopped, then eased back into place. The forest went silent at the exact same moment. I stood there, water running over my fingers, watching my reflection tremble in the darkened window above the sink. My breath had locked somewhere high in my chest, refusing to move. I didn't open the door. I didn't speak. I waited. The pressure lifted. The silence released. Night resumed as if nothing had happened. I laughed afterward, a short, brittle sound, and told myself a branch must have fallen against the door. The explanation didn't sit right, but I accepted it anyway, grateful for anything that let the fear drain away. 2 nights later, something knocked. Once not hard. The sound was wrong in its politeness, too deliberate, too controlled. I stood in the middle of the room, staring at the door, aware of how thin the wood suddenly felt. The silence pressed in, closer than before, like breath held just outside. The knock didn't repeat. Nothing else happened. The third test used my name. I was in bed when I heard it, spoken softly from beyond the boundary, pitched low and familiar. My uncle's voice, tired and calm, exactly the way it sounded when he wanted your attention without raising alarm. I sat up, heart hammering, eyes fixed on the window. My name came again, then nothing. The quiet wrapped around the cabin, thick and expectant. Every instinct I had screamed at me to answer, to call back, to break the tension before it broke me. I bit down on the inside of my cheek instead, tasting blood, and stayed silent. Minutes passed. The pressure shifted, subtle but unmistakable, as if whatever was watching had leaned back slightly. Approval wasn't the word that came to mind. Acceptance was closer. After that, the tests escalated in ways that were harder to ignore. Scratches appeared on the side of the cabin one morning, too high to reach without standing on something. Deep, parallel grooves scored into the wood, fresh enough that pale splinters still clung to the edges. They stopped short of the window, ending abruptly as if whatever made them had decided not to go further. I stood there a long time, running, my fingers just near the marks without touching them, a strange calm settling over me. It hadn't tried to get in, that mattered. The nights grew heavier after that. The silence lasted longer. The sense of attention sharpened, focused not just on where I was, but on what I was doing, how quickly I moved, how I reacted, how long it took me to notice small changes. I began, leaving objects out on purpose. The chair slightly askew, the door not fully latched. The light in the back room left on each time. Something adjusted. The chair was nudged back into place. The door tested, then left alone. The light drew the attention closer to the window. The pressure of it so intense I had to step away. I didn't understand what I was doing. Only that some part of me wanted to see how far this strange, unspoken relationship extended. I told myself it was protection. That explanation made everything easier. It allowed me to ignore the bones I found near the tree line a few days later, scattered, gnawed clean, mixed with things that didn't belong in the row. The world seems to pause. Relationship extended. Relationship extended. I told myself it was protection. That explanation made everything easier. It allowed me to ignore the bones I found near the bones I found near the bones I found. Gnawed clean is near gnawed clean. Gnawed clean mixed with things, mid-thing with thing, again with thing, and with thing in the second Amadi forest. A cracked watch face, a strip of faded fabric, the sole of a shoe, curled and chewed at the edges. Someone else had crossed the line. That night, the silence came differently, closer, heavier. It didn't wait for me to be still. It fell while I was standing at the window, staring into the dark. The pressure of attention so immediate it felt like a hand between my shoulders. That was when I saw the eyes, low to the ground, amber, off-center, just enough to make them feel wrong. They didn't blink. I raised my hand without thinking. Palm open, a gesture meant for people, not whatever stood beyond the boundary. The eyes shifted, tilting slightly, as if considering the motion. And in that instant, the belief I'd been clinging to finally cracked. It hadn't been keeping things away. It had been keeping me contained, safe enough to observe, isolated enough to evaluate, tested, measured, and adjusted in response to my behavior. The door, the knock, the voice, they weren't threats. They were questions. The silence pressed in, intimate and close, and a thought surfaced that hollowed me out as soon as it propped. And whatever watched me from the trees needed to know if I would be worth keeping. I didn't sleep after that. I lay on the bed with my eyes open, staring at the ceiling while the woods slowly remembered how to make noise again. Crickets returned first, tentative and uneven, then the wind followed, brushing the trees together in a way that sounded almost apologetic. The attention didn't leave when the silence did, it receded. Yes, but not completely. Like someone stepping back into the shadows while still watching, to see what you'd do next. By morning, exhaustion had dulled the fear into something colder and more practical. Understanding, maybe, or the illusion of it. I moved through the cabin slowly, deliberately, aware that every action now felt like it might be counted. Normal people would have left. That thought surfaced uninvited as I poured coffee, my hands steady despite the tremor in my chest. Normal people would have taken the bones as a warning. They would have taken the scratches as a threat. They would have driven back towards cell service and crowded places, and told themselves they'd gotten lucky. I stayed. I told myself it was because leaving felt dangerous in its own way, because turning my back on the clearing, on the line, on the thing that had been watching so carefully, felt like a different kind of test. I didn't want to fail it. The realization unsettled me more than the eyes had. That afternoon, I walked the boundary again. I followed the arc slowly, counting my steps, noting where the soil changed color, where leaves gathered unnaturally thick just beyond the line. In one place, the ground was scuffed. The dirt churned as if something had pivoted there repeatedly, pacing, waiting. I stopped when I reached the oak. Up close, the bark was scarred with old marks, deep grooves weathered smooth by time. Claw marks, maybe, or something that wanted to leave reminders. I stood there longer than made sense, listening to my own breathing, until a thought pressed its way forward, quiet and unwelcome. What happens when it finishes deciding? That night, the test forced an answer. I was half asleep when the screaming started. It tore through the woods beyond the boundary, sharp and human and close enough that my body reacted before my mind did. I was on my feet in seconds, heart slamming, the sound dragging something primal up from my chest. Help it wasn't a word so much as an instinct. The scream cut off abruptly, replaced by frantic movement, branches snapping, something stumbling through undergrowth, coming fast toward the clearing. Then the silence dropped, hard, so hard it felt like pressure in my skull. I stood frozen near the door, breath shallow, every nerve screaming at me to do something, to act, to break the stillness before it broke me. The sense of attention was overwhelming now, no longer distant or abstract. It pressed in close, heavy and deliberate. I knew I was being watched, not alone. I stepped onto the porch. The clearing lay pale under the moon, empty except for the faint movement of grass in the breeze. At the edge of it, just beyond the line, a shape stood where the shadows thickened, not fully revealed, not hidden. Broad shoulders hunched slightly forward, long arms hanging loose, ending in hands that were almost right and deeply wrong. Fur caught the moonlight in dull bands, dark and matted in places where scars cut through it. The eyes burned low and steady, fixed on me. It didn't move. Behind it, something else shifted in the dark, smaller, uneven, hurt. I could hear it breathe in wet and panicked, each inhale catching like it hurt to draw air. Understanding landed with sickening clarity. This wasn't an attack, it was an offer. If I stayed where I was, the line would hold. The smaller shape would not cross it. Whatever had been screaming would die out there, unseen. Its fate sealed the moment it reached the boundary. The werewolf would remain where it was, watching, learning what it needed to know. If I crossed the line, my foot moved before I finished the thought. The air changed instantly, resistance giving way like water breaking around my leg. The silence shattered, exploding outward as the woods erupted into sound again, leaves thrashing, breath roaring, a snarl ripping free that vibrated in my bones. The werewolf turned its head toward me, eyes narrowing, not in anger, but in focus, interest. The smaller shape lunged toward the clearing, desperation driving it faster than sense. I barely registered what it was human enough to wear clothes, broken enough that its movements were wrong before everything collapsed into motion. I don't remember the fight cleanly. I remember slipping on damp leaves. I remember pain blooming sharp and hot along my arm. I remember the sound of my own breath turning ragged as adrenaline burned through it. I remember the smaller thing falling, its weight going slack, its threat ending in a final, shuddering exhale. Asterisk through it all, the werewolf did not intervene. It circled, watched, adjusted its position when I did, always keeping the same measured distance, its eyes never leaving me, not helping, not hindering, observing. When it was over, I dropped to my knees in the churned dirt, shaking, blood soaking into the ground beneath me. The clearing felt wrong now, violated, the line blurred and broken where I'd crossed it. The werewolf approached. For the first time, up close, the smell hit me: wet fur, iron, old decay. It lowered its head slightly, inhaled near my face, its breath warm and steady. Then it exhaled, a low sound that resonated in my chest. Satisfied, it stepped past me, crossing the boundary I'd broken as if it had never existed, and disappeared into the trees. The woods swallowed it whole. I stayed there until dawn, afraid to move, afraid that if I did, the silence would return and I would understand something else I couldn't undo. In the morning, I packed what I could. I didn't clean the blood. I didn't look back at the tree line as I drove away. Some part of me understood that the evaluation wasn't over just because I'd left the clearing. It had learned what it needed. Weeks later, in my apartment, the nights are never quiet enough. There's always traffic, always voices, always some thin layer of noise between me and my thoughts. Still, sometimes, when everything lines up just right, I notice the absence first, a pause, a pressure, and I remember the truth that settled in. The clearing under the moon. The werewolf didn't choose me because I was strong. It chose me because I stayed. Because when tested, when measured, when faced with a line meant to contain me, I crossed it, somewhere out there, in places where the woods still know how to go silent on purpose. Something intelligent is watching again, waiting to see who else is worth keeping. This wasn't the only place like that. Asterisk, I don't sleep with the lights off anymore. It isn't a choice I make consciously. It's something my body insists on, the way it insists on breathing faster when a room goes too quiet. I leave a lamp on in the corner, the television murmuring, low, anything to keep the world from dropping away all at once. Silence feels different now. It doesn't feel empty, it feels arranged. Some nights I wake just before midnight with the same certainty I had in the cabin. My eyes opening into the dark while my mind lags behind, trying to catch up. There's no forest outside my window, no tree line for something to stand behind, but the feeling is close enough that my chest tightens anyway. I lie still, counting sounds, waiting for one of them to stop. They never all do. That's the only reason I can sleep again at all. I don't talk about what happened, not because I think people wouldn't believe me, but because belief isn't the point. There's a difference between knowing a story and sharing a secret. And what I brought back with me from that place doesn't feel like it belongs to anyone else. Once, in a grocery store parking lot, I caught my reflection in the darkened glass of a car window and felt the same reflexive urge to straighten my posture, to look composed. The sensation passed quickly, but it left me cold, standing there with my keys in my hand and no explanation that felt safe to hold on to. I understand now why it tested the way it did. It wasn't looking for strength. It wasn't interested in courage the way people talk about it, loud and sudden and reckless. It was watching for something quieter. Endurance, compliance, the ability to remain present when every instinct tells you to retreat. That's what it measured. I still think about the line sometimes, the way the air changed at its edge. The way crossing it felt like stepping into deeper water. I think about how easily I convinced myself it was there for my benefit, how comforting it was to believe I'd been singled out for protection instead of containment. I don't know what happened to the place after I left. I don't know if the clearing stayed empty or if someone else wandered into it, drawn by the same false sense of order that kept me there longer than sense should allow. What I do know is this: some boundaries aren't meant to keep things out. They're meant to see who notices them and who ignores them when it matters. If you ever find yourself somewhere that goes quiet all at once, somewhere the absence of sound feels focused instead of accidental, pay attention to what you do next. Not what you feel, not what you think it means. What you do, because being watched isn't the worst thing. Being evaluated is don't to measure places by how they respond to stillness. Crowded rooms are easy, even empty ones, most of the time. There's always some residual noise through vents, pipes ticking, a neighbor shifting weight above or below you. Silence, when it happens, has a cause you can point to. The places I avoid now are the ones that pause back. It doesn't happen often, and when it does, it's never dramatic. No sudden drop, no sharp absence. Just a subtle thinning, like sound being gently pulled away instead of cut. I notice it the way you notice pressure changes in your ears, instinctively, before your mind catches up. The first time it happened after I left the cabin, I was visiting a friend outside the city. A small house, lots of land, the kind of place people like because it feels open. We were standing in the yard at dusk, talking about nothing important, when the wind died. Not all at once, just enough. I stopped mid-sentence. My friend kept talking, unaware, while my attention slid outward, searching for the edge of the moment. Crickets still chirped, but unevenly. The trees didn't move. I felt that old urge to adjust, to look composed, to be ready. Then the wind returned. The moment passed. My friend never noticed. I didn't tell them why my hands were shaking. That's the part that stayed with me most from the clearing. Not the creature itself, but the certainty that I had been read. That my reactions, my hesitation, my decision to step forward instead of back, had all been catalogued and weighed, not judged. Judging implies morality. This was simpler than that. Useful or not. Sometimes I think about how many people must pass through places like that without realizing it. How many moments of quiet get dismissed as coincidence. How many lines go uncrossed, not because they're seen, but because there's no pressure yet to test them. I wonder how many of us are still under consideration. I still lock my doors at night. Though I live on the 4th floor now, far from any tree line, I check the windows more than necessary. I notice reflections, metal, glass, dark screens, longer than makes sense. Once, late at night, I caught my reflection in the blank television screen and thought, just for a second, that it was standing at the wrong angle. That was enough to keep me awake until morning. I don't think the werewolf followed me. I don't think it needed to. The point was never pursuit. It was never about territory in the way people understand it. The clearing wasn't special because of where it was. It was special because of what it allowed to happen there. A controlled space, a place to test behavior without interference. I understand now why the protection felt real, why it was so easy to believe the line existed for my benefit. Safety makes people compliant. Gratitude makes them stay. Fear alone might have driven me away too soon. Every now and then, I think about the smaller shape in the woods, the one that screamed. I don't know what it was, not really. I don't know if it would have crossed the line if I hadn't. I don't know if the outcome was already decided before I stepped forward. Those questions, Dan, matter as much as they used to. What matters is that the choice was presented and I made it. That knowledge sits heavy in me, an awareness I carry into other decisions, other silences. I notice when situations seem designed to see how long I'll tolerate them. I notice when patience is mistaken for suitability. I notice when staying feels easier than leaving. Sometimes, late at night, when the city noise thins just enough to feel fragile, I imagine the woods again, the way the moonlight stopped short of the trees, the way the boundary curved, invisible but firm, until I decided it was. I wonder if the clearing is empty now, or if someone else is standing just inside the line, telling themselves the quiet means they're safe. This wasn't the only place like that. I know that now, and somewhere, in a place that still understands how to go silent on purpose, something intelligent is watching, not waiting to attack, waiting to choose.